We are in the middle of, actually we're wrapping up today, a 6-week sermon series on, I called it Life is Good. For those of you who are here for the first time, the idea behind this is that, so many of us were so eager to turn the page, literally and figuratively, on 2020. And now that 2021 has arrived, in many cases, for some of the things that we were hoping to leave behind us, they are yet before us again. And I wanted to start off the new year, though, with some hope, with some optimism, to focus on the things that are going well, the reasons that we can celebrate that life is good. And despite all of the long list of things that we could say are negative or frustrating or less than we desire for our lives and for the world around us, there is much. If we pause, if we shift our gaze perhaps a little bit, if we change our mindset, we will realize that there is so much to be thankful for, so much to celebrate, and recognize that life is good. So with that, let's turn to Scripture this morning. I'm going to do 2 readings today. The first one from the Old Testament. This is from the book of Daniel, and I'll be reading midway through chapter 6, starting with verse 10. Although Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he continued to go to his house, which had windows in its upper room toward Jerusalem, and to get down on his knees 3 times a day and to pray to his God and praise him just as he had done previously. The conspirators came and found Daniel praying and seeking mercy before his God. Then they approached the king and said concerning the interdict, "O king, did you not sign an interdict that anyone who prays to anyone, divine or human, within 30 days except you, O king, shall be thrown into the den of lions?" The king answered, "The thing stands fast, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked." Then they responded to the king, "Daniel, one of your exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the interdict that you have signed, but he says his prayers 3 times a day." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about today as we wrap up this series is, what are we going to do next? What are the concrete steps, no matter how big or small, that we can take to start building the life that we want? I think we all have an idealized vision of what life could be, of what life that is satisfying or good or joy-filled or that makes us happy is all about. And we've been talking about different ideas behind what builds or what leads into a good life or the recognition that life is good. We started off by talking about some statistics that are reason to have hope, that things are actually progressing in many positive ways and getting better, whether we're talking about global poverty rates or disease. We're also been reminded that our place as Christians is probably best in second place when we continue to point to Jesus as taking the lead in our lives, no matter how dissatisfying second usually feels or what we have been taught about second place, that it's so close to first that we want first, but actually in the Christian life, we want to be in second because we want to direct our attention and our hope to Christ. We talked about things like what brings about wellness and flourishing. We talked about equations that we might put in place in our lives that actually might lead to a greater sense of happiness. But today I want to go back to the basics, to the building blocks of what life is all about. You heard Lynn and Andrew a moment ago sing that song, "Take Time to Be Holy," and then there was this bridge of the song that Andrew wrote for us. And he used some words that calls to mind how it is that our lives are shaped. I believe the words that we just all sang, or we heard them sing, were that our thoughts become our words, and our words become our actions, and our actions become our character and our habits, and that leads to how we are living our lives. So I want to break that down for us. If we think about our lives as a whole and what looks like a good life or a life that we say is good before us, we're looking at our life as a whole, the big picture. Right? But if we break that down a little bit, how do we break down our lives into more digestible portions? We look at our years, and our years become our months, and our months are weeks, days, and so forth. But when we get down to that day level, when we get down to that base level, the building block level, we recognize that our days are largely made up of routines. And our routines are comprised of our habits. So we have good habits and we have bad habits. I'm sure we could all come up with a list of many of the bad habits that we do. We're probably more inclined to think about our bad habits than we are our good habits, just like we are more easily able to name all the things that we think are going wrong than the things that are good. So think about some of your bad habits. Those easily come to mind, right? I was thinking about those earlier. Yeah, I still bite my nails despite the fact that my mother my whole life has told me not to do that. I still hold my pencil incorrectly, even though I was corrected on that in elementary school. I probably mispronounced some words unknowingly as a bad habit, and I'm sure that if you polled my family members, they could list a whole host of other bad habits that I have as well. So we know about bad habits, but what about the good habits? What are they, and how do we build up more good habits in our lives? Because the idea here is that if we are able to control some of the good habits, and we pile on those good habits or layer them, we will realize that they will become our routines. And our routines then become our days, and our days eventually become our lives, right? As a friend, a colleague, and mentor of mine, Ron Martoya, says, our days are our life in miniature. Our days are our lives in miniature. So how we organize our day, how we build routines out of our habits will, in effect, greatly shape our lives. So if you want a changed life, if you want to live life differently, or if you want a different perspective on your life, then it stands to reason that we must begin with the habits that make up our lives, because they start with the habits, it leads to the routines, and then all of a sudden now we are living very different lives than letting our habits control us, or our negative habits, I should say, control us. So as I just read to you from the book of Daniel, Daniel's an interesting, I think, choice for today, but the fact of the matter is that in going through the whole Bible, there's not a lot in the Bible as far as here's how to build holy and healthy habits in your life. I mean, that's just not what the Bible is interested in telling us about. And yet, in Daniel's story and elsewhere in the Bible, we see glimpses of people that have put into place practices that are really good for their lives. We hear about things like fasting. We hear about things like tithing. We hear about things like regular attention to the scriptures. And we learn about a whole host of other ways that we can live virtuous and holy lives, as far as ways that we conduct ourselves, how we treat other people, how we serve one another, and so forth. And all that's important, but it all goes back to those habits. Where do we start with the habits? So in Daniel's story, you may remember this story, and as a child, if you grew up in the Christian faith, you probably are familiar with two parts of Daniel's story. There's the furnace, and then there's the lion's den. And we're not talking about necessarily the part where either of those things are happening, although one is yet ahead of us and one is behind us. So Daniel, along with a whole host of other people, are taken out of Judea and Jerusalem, and they are taken in exile, and they are moved to a faraway land. And there they are put to work by the king and his leadership. Daniel rises to the top along with three of his companions, who we find out their names, at least the names that the king Nebuchadnezzar gives them, is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we find out that those three have risen to a place of prominence in the culture because they are bright people. But they are also devout to their Jewish ancestry and practices and faith. And so what we find out that happens before today's reading is that they are trapped by some people who become jealous of them. They are rising in the ranks quickly, and it causes a lot of jealousy. And so people try to persuade the king to have everybody worship a golden image, and when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel refuse to do it, they're thrown into the furnace, and they survive that, which just gives them greater prestige and credibility in the king's eyes, and Nebuchadnezzar elevates them even further. But then he dies, and the next king takes over, and the next king is sort of enamored with them too, but the jealousy ensues, and so these conspirators rise to the surface, and they say, hey, let's come up with a new strategy. This time, let's convince the king that everybody has to pray only to the king for 30 days. And anybody who violates that, well, they'll be fed to the lions. So that's where we find ourselves in today's story. The king has signed off on this document. It's an official edict or interdict, and it has gone out to the whole kingdom. And Daniel refuses to give up what we now find out is his practice or his habit of praying 3 times a day, morning, noon, and night. He goes into his bedroom, he opens the window, faces Jerusalem, and he prays morning, noon, and night on his knees. You know, it's one of the closest things that we can find in much of the Bible to somebody that is engaging in a regular habit, in a regular routine in his life. And we will talk about this yet in a bit, but I think that this brings Daniel a sense of peace, a sense of normalcy. When everything in his life is in upheaval, when things look chaotic around him, he is grounded and he is centered in his habit and his practice and daily rhythm of praying morning, noon, and night. Despite the consequences, that's what he's going to do. And we find out that he does get found out. People see him doing it. He gets reported to the king, and he gets thrown into the lion's den, which, of course, we know that God allows him to survive. But it goes back to this idea that this habit is essential to our well-being. Habits are a popular thing to talk about right now in terms of wellness, in terms of our own lives and how we live healthy lives. In fact, if you look at any of the bestseller lists right now, you are bound to find some books on habit making and healthy habit formation. In 2018, a book came out by a guy named James Clear called Atomic Habits. James Clear is really one of the foremost authorities on habit making in the world at this time. In fact, he regularly writes for the New York Times. He has been on all the morning talk shows. He wrote this book, Atomic Habits, as I said a few years ago, and it has been on the bestseller list ever since. He sold over 1 million copies. And even this last year, at the end of 2020, I went on the bestsellers for the year 2020, and the final week of the year, his book, Atomic Habits, was still number 3 on the bestsellers on Amazon in the nonfiction category. And it cracked the top 30 on the New York Times bestseller list last year. So 3 or 4 years into writing this book, it's still in the top 30 because people are interested in how can I create healthy habits. So as I was reading through this book and inspired by so much of it, and so much of what he says makes so much sense, I want to share some key insights for you. And I'd still make a plug for the book. I think it's good to read. But here are the 4 things that he say helps us to consider when making up a brand new healthy habit. So how to create a good habit. And I'll walk you through these. He says, make it obvious, make it attractive, make it easy, and make it satisfying. So let's break these down a little bit, and I'm going to give you an example of a made-up thing. Let's say you wanted to live a healthier lifestyle. Well, the first thing that you want to do is to make it obvious. Well, that's not a terribly obvious goal, right? Any number of things can go into living a healthier lifestyle, but how are you going to make it obvious? What is your clear goal in this situation? So let's say, for example, that you wanted to refine that a bit, and you say, part of a healthy lifestyle to me is going to be exercise. Let's refine that further. I want to start running, okay? So your goal is to make it obvious. My goal is to participate in running, say, 3 times a week, all right? So let's make, so now the goal is obvious, right? The goal is obvious, so we're going to be on our way to making a good habit. Then we want to make it attractive. So if you are not already a runner or this is not part of what you have done in the past, how are you going to make this more attractive to you? As someone who hasn't always enjoyed running in his life, I would say that it is not an attractive thing. It may be a good thing to do, but it's not an attractive thing to do. So how am I going to make it attractive? Well, maybe, he says, one of the things that you can do in terms of making it attractive is get yourself involved in a group of people where that is the norm in that community. So find yourself a group of friends who also enjoy running and pick up the hobby with them. Pick up the practice of doing that with them regularly. Or maybe he says, try something else that almost feels like a very positive association that you can make with that. So what if every day that you are going to go running, you make a 3-song playlist? And as you are preparing and suiting up to go running, or as you are driving to the place where you're going to go run a trail, you listen to those 3 songs that pump you up and get you in the right attitude. Or maybe it's some other ritual that you can put in place that you now associate with the days that you're going to go running. And so you make it an attractive thing to do. The next one is make it easy. So often what we do is we find that there are an infinite number of small excuses that become easy cop-outs for us instead of doing the actual thing that we're trying to habituate. And so, for example, one of the things that I have found is so helpful on the days that I want to exercise is I will lay out my shorts, my socks, my shoes, and my shirt that I'm going to exercise in right next to the bed. I mean, when I swing my foot off the edge of the bed, I step on the clothes that I'm going to exercise in. Because if I've got to go into the closet or go into the laundry room and find that thing or find the towel and all the things that I want with me, if it becomes difficult for me, it's just that much easier not to do it. So you make these things easy. You make it as simple as possible for you to engage in this behavior and not to do away with it. And then lastly, he says, make it satisfying. So give yourself maybe a reward immediately following this thing that you want to make into a new habit. So maybe if it's the running thing, so maybe it's after you get home, you're going to pour yourself a glass of ice cold water and follow that up with a cup of fresh brewed coffee, or whatever it is that feels like a reward for you in doing that. Okay, so let's take something else. Let's say it's you want to read through the Bible in a year's time. Okay, so you've made an obvious goal. You've got a timeline, you've got a goal. That's obvious. You want to make it attractive. How can I do that? What can I do to make the Bible reading more attractive to me? Well, what if I create a little a reading nook in my house? Or what if I light a scented candle? Or what if I play some soft music in the background that prepares the space for doing that? And now all of a sudden, again, you create ritual around this, and it makes it more attractive to do that than just looking at this giant Bible sitting on the shelf that you say, I really don't know where to begin. Then you want to make it easy. So go download one of the free apps that gives you a psalm, an Old Testament, a New Testament, and an epistle reading each day, so that you're doing this in digestible sections instead of saying, I'm going to try to finish Genesis by the end of the month, which feels like a big job if you're trying to do that every single day. Make it easy. And then lastly, make it satisfying for yourself. Maybe you bought yourself a brand new Bible for this process, or maybe you're going to go in with a brand new highlighter and highlight the things each day that you feel are key takeaways for you for that day or for that week. How is this going to be satisfying? Or do you want to do it with somebody else that you can engage in conversation with as you are participating in this? So I think you can put this to a lot of different practices, and these simple steps will help break down something that feels like kind of an overwhelming goal for many people, and break it down into ways that you can easily take in and eventually begin to make into a habit. So let's just take Daniel's practice, praying 3 times a day. What does he do? Well, it's obvious. He is going to pray 3 times a day, morning, noon, and night. Okay? The goal is clear. How is he going to make that attractive? Well, it says that he opens his windows and he faces Jerusalem. Now remember, Daniel is in exile. He is not in his homeland. He is yearning for his family, his relationships, and his place that he calls home. And so it's attractive to him every time to feel that connection with his homeland and his connection to God as he faces Jerusalem, the epicenter of his religious world at the time. It's attractive to him to do that. He makes it easy. He has the same spot that he goes every day, back to his room. It's set up for his prayer practice. He doesn't have to find a dark corner. He doesn't have to stop what he's doing in the middle of the day and find a space and go into a room where he can pray in private. He has a practice in place. He has simplified this for himself and made it quite easy. And it's satisfying because he feels that connection to God. He feels that connection to his community. He feels that connection to his homeland. And there is something very satisfying in knowing that he is fulfilling his religious practice by doing this every day. So I think that we can do this. And I know that these are easy steps that you can start to take that create the habits that when layered upon layer, you will soon eventually begin to realize that these are the practices that become the building blocks of a good life for us. I want to share a second scripture with you now, and this one is from the Gospel according to Mark. And here I want you to recognize something that Jesus does as well. This is from the first chapter, starting with verse 29. As soon as they left the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told him about her at once. He came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. Then the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening at sunset, they brought to him all who were sick or possessed with demons. And the whole city was gathered around the door. And he cured many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons, and he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. In the morning, while it was still very dark, he got up and he went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. And Simon and his companions hunted for him. And when they found him, they said to him, "Everyone is searching for you." He answered, "Let us go on to the neighboring towns, so that I may proclaim the message there also, for that is what I came out to do." And he went throughout Galilee, proclaiming the message in their synagogues and casting out demons. So Jesus cures one woman. And all of a sudden, as word spreads rapidly throughout the community, it says that the whole city is gathered outside the doors, waiting for Jesus. And he's curing as many as he can. And then finally, it's too late into the night, and he must retreat, and he goes to bed for the night. You know, it feels like for so many of us, as Lynn said at the beginning of the service, I mean, it feels like the battle rages on right now for so many. The struggles, the uncertainty, the hardship, the concerns about our health, waiting on the end of a pandemic or our time for the vaccine to come or what have you. It feels like there's so much uncertainty. So many of you have described your life as like the movie Groundhog's Day, and one day bleeds into the next, and we press repeat, and we've lost all semblance of sense of time, and life just seems so chaotic right now. And when Jesus feels the pressure of all those people coming around him and things are slipping beyond his control so quickly, what does he do? He wakes up early in the morning. He retreats to a place in solitude, and there he prays. And he begins this practice again that becomes a habit for him that we see him repeat other times throughout the Gospels. And whenever things get to be a bit overwhelming, he needs to find that grounded place again. He needs to go back to square one and say, I am going to have a little bit more control over my life. I am going to begin to practice these things that become habits for me that clear my head and allow me to take on what is before me. And I'm in control this time. And so by the time that his disciples came and they found him, and they've been hunting for him, they find him, and they say, "We've been looking for you." And Jesus says, "Okay, I'm ready to do this again." And instead of letting everything control him, he finds more control in his life to do exactly what he needs to do. And he starts off with that most basic of practices of taking time to find centering, to be grounded again, and to be in prayer. You alone know what those habits are that you may be interested in engaging or taking on in your life. You know the things that you would like to shed and leave behind and say, those are negative habits that I have that are not really giving me any quality of life. They are not life-giving, they are life-depleting. And in our time when things are so chaotic, when we feel so addicted to distraction, when everything around us seems to be something that captures or demands our attention, we need to take control again and look to those things that become the building blocks for how we live a better life of wellness, flourishing, and eventually getting to the place where we can say that, in fact, our lives are very good. And for us as people of faith, that begins with emulating people like Jesus and Daniel and those who said it begins with creating habits that are healthy, holy, and life-giving. May we find those things. May we reclaim the days which become our weeks, which become our months, which becomes our year, which becomes our lives. And recognize in those things, once we have established what it is that is of utmost priority and importance to us, that life is good.